I am Dr. Amani Morrison. I am the lead principal investigator of the Mellon Sawyer seminar on creative placemaking, Black restorative ecologies, and Black spatial futures. The session that we're about to go into right now is our third panel, Black ecologies, Black futures. And it will culminate what has been a 2-day symposium on placing Black futures, working theories. I'm going to first introduce our moderator, and our moderator will then introduce our guests. Dr. Kelsey Alejandra Moore is a Provost Distinguished Faculty Fellow and Assistant Professor of African American History and Black Studies. Her work focuses on rural Black Southern histories, raising questions about race, religion, culture, and ecologies in the 20th century. Her current book project, Black Benthic, interrogates how rural development in South Carolina's Santee Cooper Basin inflicted spiritual, ecological, and epistemic violence against Black and Indigenous peoples. Through a close examination of the Santee Cooper Hydroelectric and Navigation Project, Black Benthic demonstrates how the ritualistic nature of modernization collapsed various notions of time, space, and place. As an inaugural 2022-23 Crossroads Research Fellow based at Princeton University, Moore created We Just Don't Trust Our Memories to Stone, a digital project that remaps cemeteries flooded by the Santee Cooper Hydroelectric and Navigation Project. In doing so, the digital project remembers various conjure knowledges necessary to the lives and deaths of Black South Carolinians. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Kelsey Moore.
Thank you for that introduction. It's so good to be here and see new and familiar faces. I'm happy for today's discussion. So since we're a little bit short on time, I do want to let everyone know that one of our panelists, Dr. Danielle Purfoy, won't be here today. But I join me in welcoming the other two panelists that are here. So our first panelist is Dr. J.T. Roane. Dr. J.T. Roane is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Geography and an Andrew M. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and he is a 2008 graduate of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. He is the author of Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, published in 2023. And his short experimental film, Plot, received support from Prince's Crossroads Fellowship. He also currently serves as a member of Just Harvest, Tidewater, an Indigenous and Black-led organization building toward food sovereignty and justice in Virginia's historical plantation region through political and practical education. His presentation today is titled Transforming Mississippi America, June Jordan and the Question of Landed Futures. Our second panelist is Dr. Joy Priest. Poet and scholar Joy Priest is the author of Horsepower, selected by Natasha Trethway as the winner of the Donald Hall Prize for Poetry, and the editor of Once a City Said, a Louisville Poets Anthology. She is a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Fine Arts Work Center Fellowship, and the Stanley Kunitz Memorial Prize for the American Poetry Review. And her poems and essays have appeared in the Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Sewanee Review, among many others. Priest is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh and the curator of community programs and practice at the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics. Her presentation today is entitled The Black Outside, How Black Ecologies Led Us Out of Western Enclosure. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you so much, both of you especially, but everybody who's making this possible and the signers as well. I really appreciate your labor. Oh, sorry. Normally I'm so loud. I didn't want to do that. This has been an awesome gathering so far. I think this is just to be in the room with so many amazing Black spatial thinkers working across different domains is really inspiring. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. Um, so working on June Jordan and this approach through Black intellectual history is novel for me. I'm not used to writing about people who have had so much directly and sometimes confrontationally and sometimes inspiringly and sometimes artistically to say for themselves, recorded and preserved, and about which such a rich, dynamic, and intimate archive exists. My first two projects, the Dark Agora's work and a new companion work titled something like Dark or Black Anarchic, investigate the role of working class and migrant placemaking in Philadelphia. These are in fugitive archives, mostly that I come with to engage with Dr. Celeste Winston's very useful breakdown yesterday, meaning mostly illicit or in this kind of territory um, that's difficult to kind of engage often through a kind of sparseness. So, I mean, one, these are archives of often of literal state repression that happen to capture something about Black place um, and I draw on the kind of analytics of Black feminist historicism and the urban to make this work for me. And Holly Ma, who I've seen here, is a great example of doing this kind of work. Richly Sarah Haley, LaShawn Harris, colleague Rose Cheryl Hicks, etc. Or two, the archives I work with are normally associated with the underground or the set apart in network, Dark Agoras. They're associated with the lumpen, the unproductive, the cultish, etc. And in many cases, they're overdetermined by masculine figures of authority working their own forms of charisma and power that overshadow subaltern formations within subaltern formations. In both those works, I try to understand the ways that these forces conflated by planners, public health officials, politicians, and even community organizers as sinister forms of darkness animate a critical axis of mid and late 20th century Black spatial politics, even as they're often also subsumed in the service of civil rights and sometimes even Black power formulations as the discordant, the inchoate mass right in the city to be contained and shaped only as a leverage point. These are archives of traces of fleeting and fugitive possibility of worlds in the world that sometimes only survive to us in the moment of their suppression, containment, or redirection, even if we're trying to redirect them towards our own liberatory ends. Jordan, of course, as a writer, brings me full frontal with herself and her own ideas. There is an overabundance in terms of her relationships, her communities, her engagements, her erotic and romantic lives, and frankly, her publications of what she had to say for herself. This provides a surprising battery of new challenges, breaking down very quickly my thought that these would be more contained archives than those that I had worked for the first two projects. Despite the challenges I've come to resolve I've come to a resolve about committing to this work around June Jordan, and it feels timely as I see her getting her due, despite being marked outside of mainstream literary centrality, um, despite her productivity and profundity, because of her effort, for example, for Palestinian solidarity, her bearing witnesses in places against the edicts of U.S. foreign policy through war and violence. And I think I know Alexis Gums is starting to work around Jordan, and I think this is wonderful. We need multiple biographies of one of the most published authors of the 20th century. And if there is a minute about Abraham Lincoln or somebody else, some other old dead white man, that at least we could get a few about June Jordan. Let me give you a quick sense of the outline of the book, and then I'll jump into what I really want to get to. Um, So the first chapter, write in, the double sense or the double word, the multitude, I engaged the co-development of Jordan's spatial thought and her theorization of politics, sociality, and infrastructures through her youth-centered literature and planning work from 1964, when she experienced the Harlem Uprising, until 1970, when her thought was transformed by successive trips to Mississippi and the Mediterranean. In the second chapter, Transforming Mississippi America, which I'll talk more about today, I'm trying to recover Jordan's radical horizon making as a grounded prophet in relation to questions of collective transformation through the remaking of land and relationships around land, centering on an unpublished draft novel she composed between 1976, 1981, and 1996. I'll get more into this, but this fictional work set in a collective land project carved from a historical plantation in the Mississippi Delta emerged from her experience with local organizers, especially Fannie Lou Hamer, and the juxtaposition between Mississippi's what she called hunger counties and its alluvial abundance, as well as the juxtaposition between Mississippi and the Greek island of Mykonos, where there was no visible hunger despite it being what Jordan described perhaps dismissively as a rock. In chapter 3, Staging Abolition, Standing Against the Police and the Klan, I turned to Jordan's efforts in the 1980s and 1990s to use the theatrical and musical stage to advance critical public engagement with ongoing racism in the US, exemplified by police murders of unarmed Black teenagers and children, as well as the endurance of white supremacist organizations like the Klan. In chapter 4, Intifada USA, I engaged Jordan's critiques of war and global apartheid structures, from her opposition to US containment wars waged in Vietnam and Cambodia to the immediate post 9/11 world. She's writing on literally on her deathbed. After 9/11, she's still writing from her deathbed critically about this moment. But so with a specific emphasis on this chapter on her critical support for South Africans and Palestinians in their struggle against Israeli aggression in that context. Jordan held a number of recorded and archived teachings, as well as composing essays, poetry, and other materials conveying a damning criticism of US imperial force. She also organized protests and made visits to bear witness to the effects of US imperialism abroad, ranging from Lebanon to Nicaragua and back. Chapter 5, Towards a Poetic Remaking of Community and Nature, examines her years after 1989 in Berkeley, California, which extended her critical artistic and intellectual interventions, launched against ecocide, following her direct experiences with the collapse in infrastructures during the 1989 earthquake, and then later the Great East Bay Fire, as well as attacks by logging companies on environmental justice organizers in Northern California protecting the redwoods. So let's get to it. In summer 1970, June Jordan took off from New York City, headed to Mississippi. She was on assignment from the New York Times Magazine for an article about the post-civil rights era there. During her trip, Jordan traveled to the state to interact with the organizers, activists, and artists who had faced down Jim Crow and who continued to face the hostility and violence of recalcitrant white supremacist financial, social, and political interests. She went to focus on how these people continued their ordinary lives in the aftermath of their world history-making effort to transform the state's political, social, and economic structures. Working her beat as a journalist with the perspective resources of a poet to undo her own, as well as her readers' misperceptions that Mississippi was simply a place of monsters, Jordan moved among the people of Jackson, Clarksdale, and Coahoma counties, Ruleville, Mound Bayou, as well as other locations, garnering her face-to-face encounters, quote, shaking some warm Black hands and glimpsing some live Black people who are determined to stay and to direct their own survival in this place. She used her 5-week extended encounter to generate a profile of what she described in the published essay as Black Home. Riding along the expansive landscape of Mississippi's distinctive environments, observing the zone between the airport and downtown Jackson, noting Jackson's quiet compared to New York City, seeing the substantial suburban home of Dr. Aaron Shirley and Alia Brown Shirley, leaders of the United Front and Mississippi's only Head Start program, respectively. Spending time with her peer author and friend Alice Walker and her husband and daughter navigating their socially taboo interracial marriage in the Capitol. Feeling the heat of the sun and the thickness of the air along the coast between Biloxi and Gulfport, and bearing witness along the highway there to a vicious white-on-white murder related to road rage, interacting with those rural communities in the Delta, seeing the expanses of cotton and also the alternative place building of Fannie Lou Hamer and her Freedom Farm Collective, meeting and learning from Charles Evers, brother of slain organizer Medgar Evers, to hear of his continued efforts, and traveling to the famous Black controlled town of Mound Bayou with Hamer to explore for herself the potential of such an enterprise, Jordan came to appreciate Mississippi, the people and the place, as, quote, a beautiful and long blues song of actual fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, and little girls doing their daily brave thing, making that awesome state into a Black home. More than an end, however, publishing Mississippi Black Home, A Sweet and Bitter Blues Song, Mississippi, as a chronicle of her 5 weeks there, initiated Jordan into renewed and transformational thinking about the power and potential of land and the relations it grounded in Mississippi and the US more generally. This radicalization, I understand through Jordan's increasing clarity that a direct assault on property was the primary means of reformulating space toward liberatory ends for people and place. This element was already present in the earlier youth and children's work of the earlier 1970s, where I discussed in the first chapter, she wrote protagonists taking direct action in the present to transform the conditions of racial violence and exclusion. In the broader chapter I'm drawing on here, we begin to appreciate how her intimacy with Black people in Mississippi brought her to view the ultimate transformation of these conditions in the radical re-territorialization of plantation geographies as their historical source and in their enduring afterlives in her present through infrastructures, most fundamentally property itself. Central to this project were her growing interventions within critical spatial thought toward what Maya Butler theorizes as literary geographies, or the formulations and reformulations of spatial relations using various modes of writing to draw out alternative features of social spatial organization and mobilizing creativity and remixing in literary technique to engender new possibilities in the material world. Jordan used drafting from this work to reimagine the basis for collectivity at interregional scales through the healing of generational spatial trauma, through annealing the contradictions inherent in Black placemaking, uprooted from Southern and rural contexts by mechanization and land subsidies for wealthy planters and landowners, and destabilized in Northern and urban contexts by deindustrialization and urban renewal / Negro removal. Critically, Jordan's radicalization was enhanced by sequence that followed her time in Mississippi that helped to sharpen her analysis of her observations there. First, the precious recordings with people such as Fannie Lou Hamer and Charles Evers were confiscated or stolen by Italian officials and never returned when she attempted to take them to Rome in 1971, following her winning of the Roane Prize in Environmental Design at the American Academy, where she hoped to work through this novel. Next were her encounters with the people and the land in the Mediterranean countries shortly on the heels of her trip to the American South. The contrast between what she perceived as the sparseness of the Greek island Mykonos, along with its people's relative well-being, contrasted with Mississippi's alluvial abundance and concentration of hunger counties, underscoring and heightening Jordan's critical engagements with property in the earth itself. Finally, despite early promises of publication of her work on Mississippi as a monograph by a mainstream press, Knopf rejected the project when her work materialized as criticism of land relations in Mississippi and the US rather than a herald of the so-called good news out of the Deep South. I think that's important because she's being, even as she's at the height of her literary career, she's being censored. The larger chapter recovers Jordan's radical horizon making as a grounded prophet in relation to questions of collective transformation through the remaking of land and place without property. I ground my analysis of the drafts toward the end of this chapter, where I devote most of my analysis in the larger form to the unpublished works related to Mississippi, evolving from an essay called Evolving from Mississippi Black Home across works such as her children's biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, and coursing through a series of unpublished works, including a how-to guide that she titled More Than Enough, and in the unpublished novel form, Okay Now, Jordan moved between critical modes, deepening her critique of property and the state's guarantee through violence in what she called Mississippi America. In the process, she built out creatively from a diagnostic of conditions in the early 1970s, land and property, to the outline of possible futures, coursing amongst these drafts of Okay Now, inspired between an analysis of on-the-ground conditions and the generation of a fictive horizon at once feasible and radical, especially in its advocacy for the transformation of existing land relations outside individual ownership. Her novel centers themes of organizing towards mutuality and geographic transformation, not along a romantic arc, but rather in the heat and messiness of such an endeavor. Critically, Jordan, and I think that resonates as well with Celeste last night, talking about the complexity of abolition. Critically, Jordan's archive of unpublished works centering Mississippi also invites us to reimagine how we belong together in space and time through a collectivity grounded in new relations that take the land not as their passive backdrop, but their primary object of consideration. Her premise in the fictional version was that in a small opening made through a form of collective stewardship, rich forms of alternative homecoming and homemaking could proliferate. This was an invitation to revisit older cultural and social spatial forms in order to revolutionize their valence and power towards something stabilizing and life-generating, and away from the death-dealing drive of viewing the earth as a cotton plantation. Building on Danielle Purifoy's instructive work to rethink the contradictory formulations of Black property, as well as Jarvis McInnes's critical approach to the afterlives of the plantation and its reuse, I describe this as homecoming, emphasizing the vexed and complicated nature of such a return to such a home for Jordan and for the intended audiences of Black communities South and North. Jordan's outlook drew to the surface dimensions to place and theorizing a space centering shared tenancy and cooperative living against the motley armed regime of US imperializing property. This emphasis on intimacy and place through homecoming places this alongside her thought and other work like Living Room and other such theoretical and rhetorical recourses within her thinking to spaces associated with intimacy and with small scale place as metaphorical and material sites, dense with questions about how communities of people relate not just sentimentally, but in the practical matters of living and dying. And I'm drawing on Erica Edwards' instructive contribution to the exhibition catalog for the American Academy's recent exhibition of June Jordan, which I find so fascinating because June Jordan left 6 months into her fellowship at the Academy, so I'm not sure she would have been they would have been that happy about her right after she left. Jordan's, I want to, in the interest of time, I want to just point out that I want to skip ahead. So after a bit, Jordan experiences Knopf's rejection as who basically responds to her in the mid 1970s with "Who are you to write on land reform," which I think reflects both the reality of censorship for Black feminist writers in this period, despite the proliferation of their writing, when they get to certain moments of what they want to write, they're blocked. But also, I think the waning support for Black power texts in general. So she starts on my land, they like, girl, bye. Rather than backing down, Jordan began to think of the project fully as a fictional one after this experience, after she tried a how-to guide and some other stuff. This meant a further radicalization of her aims and efforts. By 1976, Jordan opened the controlling intellectual background, outlining the proposed novel, Okay Now, set in the Delta with a powerful statement. Quote, we must learn to share the earth while there's still time to try. In the pointed urgency of her words, Jordan began to explicitly come to the prevention of total ecological. Jordan began to explicitly connect, the prevention of total ecological and social destruction with the reformulation of primary social relations outside of property. According to Jordan, quote, America has more than enough power and natural and fabricated resources to make this nation a haven for all of its people. At the same time, quote, America also possesses more than enough power and genocidal precedent, tendency, and suicidal obeisance to the industrial values of efficiency and increase in profit to destroy the earth now and forever. With a didactic vision in mind that extended from that mode within her earlier children's and young adults literature, from between 64 and 1970, she designed the fictional drafts to get readers to see that, quote, we are not helpless here in Mississippi, America. We can rescue the community of Brownsville in Brooklyn and the town of Ruralville, Mississippi, as surely and as easily as we can rescue the Lockheed Corporation. She contrasted the engorging of Lockheed, the pointed symbol of growth and prosperity for the few, dependent on war and broad ecological and social devastation, with the collective's power to transform urban and rural conditions. Across the published and unpublished works associated with her experiences in Mississippi, Jordan worked to show the ways that reimagining community through the question of land, laboring, and struggling together, caring for one another, sustaining living infrastructures like Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Fund Project, which Tiana Williams is writing about, as well as through a kind of spirited and sensual personal transformation, could humanity realistically and radically draw out new relations between themselves and the earth? Thank you.
Okay. So I'm gonna be that annoying person that changes the title of their presentation right before they give it. When I was asked what I wanted to call it, I gave it something I feel is like the general spirit behind what I'm thinking about. But I have a lot going on with titles right now because this project that I'm working on is like has many moving interdisciplinary parts. So what I've decided to do is just make it a little bit more specific, like how Black ecology leads us out of Western enclosure, but specifically like through where we see that in literature, like literary placemaking, and through the sound of poems or like traditionally understood as chantings. So let's see. Oh, I do need my computer. I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm a poet and a journalist by training. So I like that you invoked that about June Jordan. So you're gonna hear some poems in case you were like, I didn't come here for a poetry reading, but you're gonna hear some poems. So I'm just gonna start out with two poems from my first book, to get into a conversation about literary mapping, but I want you to be able to see and hear them. So let me make this. How do you zoom in? Oh. Yeah, if I can just, yeah, that's fine. Okay. This is the title poem to the book, and it's the first poem that appears in the book. Can y'all see? Okay. Horsepower. Off season, before the racetrack opens, I jump through the threshold of my back door stable side. A dove takes off from its nest, tucked into the corner of the porch awning, glides through my world, which I can see in its entirety from my top step. The twin steeples and emerald roofs just past our garage. A horse practicing its start out of the gate. Only Longfield, that avenue rounding the perimeter of the pill-shaped track where the red and white and green flags ripple from balconies, and my neighbors sell horchata in styrofoam cups, street tacos, and paper baskets with cilantro and lime. Only Longfield in a chain-link fence separates the horse's air from mine. They work the loop of that circular mile, making everyone's living except their own, the motors of our economy. Beyond the spires is a larger world I do not know exists. A mile west in my line of vision is a family I do not know I have. In that corner of the city, separating from the land like a cell in mitosis, straining across the Ohio River to the north, my great aunt, Black matriarch, rocks on her blue porch, and my father, just a couple of blocks away from her, coos my baby brother into sleep while his new wife flowers the wings of a flightless bird. But all I know for now is my grandfather, the white one. And I know my mother, who I can hear now roaring home from work in her muscle car. And wait, I know the horses and their restless minds. So I'm from Kentucky. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, right across the street. Like I can throw a rock and hit it. The stable side of Churchill Downs, where they run the Kentucky Derby every year. So like I grew up across the street from horses. I could smell them. And I often was allowed to go and walk with them and touch them and that sort of thing. Louisville's a very segregated city. It's the fourth most segregated city in the country after Detroit, Milwaukee, and Cleveland, but it's not talked about a lot because we don't think about Kentucky a lot. Usually outside of Kentucky, the things that I hear when I say I'm from Kentucky, it's like, oh, you've not really thought about Kentucky except for in a very particular context. So I just think as a Southern place, it doesn't get as much attention, but it's like split down the middle in terms of segregation. So that's the poem. It was kind of getting at the mapping of that and how it intersects with a life. And then this other one, what you need to know about this one is the Park Hill is one of the housing projects in Louisville. And I wrote this poem in conversation with Robert Frost's Directive, which is about a sort of straight path that a flaneur kind of figure takes, a pedestrian kind of figure takes. Can we give it up for the sign language people? I was telling them, they was telling me earlier that some of the words we're using, it takes like several concepts to explain with their, and so I really think they're a part of this conference because they're doing a kind of like poetics of translation for us. So, okay, this is called Drift. It becomes too much for us, so we take a dip, ride aimless down this parkway, parting unruly brush, nature so heavy it feels at any moment, ready to erupt and absorb this silly city men have made. We are magnificent, and overhead the trees crowd like a mob into canopy. The butt of his box Chevy sways across double yellow bars, eroded lanes cutting east to west on our side of the city, Beach and Cypress, 22nd and 18th, where it turns into Dixie. Past Park Hill's dual yellow brick, its clotheslines and identical yards, building after number building crossing the glass globe of my eye. Past the hair store, Grand Market, the apartments where my father lived when I met him, and the loud teal awning of Shark's Fish and Chicken. I sit shotgun sans seatbelt, Tonight, not gutted with that tell for fear. Maniac leant behind the wheel, eyes nearly closed. In his gut, a fistful of pills, tiny yellow footballs. Before he slams into that giant pin oak down the parkway, before the steam and the rust flakes floating through the one beam of that insistent headlight, that street lamp giving up to the dark, something telling me to get out. When I leave his gray caprice, I step out of a dimension, a place in my youth I can't return to. How quick the fire turns to ash as I hand the smoke to him. He is pulling away. The cigarello is slipping through his dangled fingers to join the ground like every ending thing. He's done enough to escape our streets, numbered or named for the trees. Okay. I'm also thinking, because I was looking through Black Agoras before I came, and Dr. Roane's book, and it reminded me of something I forgot about because I was working on it a while, like maybe 10 years ago. But that all our park system in Louisville was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, and these were the white neighborhoods, but now it's like the Black side of town. And so I'm thinking about how, like, what type of Black commons are made in those parks now. They're like, he designed it to where there's major parkways that all connect with parks. And so the parkway I was talking about in the poem, Algonquin Parkway, it leads to Chickasaw and Shawnee Park, for example. Okay, so in the beginning, after this book came out in 2020, I finished it 6 years ago though, but it came out in 2020. It's a book I wrote in my 20s. The thing I kept getting, like feedback I kept getting or questions I kept getting about it was like to sort of talk about being a writer of place. And that's not something I had thought about. I was just writing what I knew. I was just writing where my experiences. But after I left Kentucky, I realized that is a very Kentucky and a very Appalachian mode of poetry. Like storytelling is a big deal, even as narrative poetry starts to phase out in contemporary in current literature. It's a thing that remains in our work. So I didn't really know what that meant. Like, what does it mean to be a poet of place? Like, what does that involve? And a poet did this review of my book and used this term literary mapping. And this is a term used by the scholar Frank D. Rashad. In the review, she writes, as the collection lists, talking about horsepower, as the collection lists location after location, addresses, businesses, highways, neighborhood routes, a map emerges. And that map is an argument. These are the locations that matter. The collection centers the margins of Louisville until the omnipresent horse racing track fades into the background. In result, Louisville's communities, histories, and inequalities emerge. And so I started to think, yeah, I'm not just describing a place, I'm remapping and in turn rehistoricizing my hometown, which is a tourist city, where those who like keep this thing running, this machine running behind the scenes, its workers are invisible. And so literary mapping was a useful tool for plotting the book's verbal world onto a spatial one. And I started to think about this idea that a poetry collection or a sequence could have a spatial world or could create a spatial world. And so I just finished my doctorate in May, but later, thank you. Black people gonna clap about that every time. So I'm like a little baby scholar now, but it's like, so later in my life, I decided, oh no, I want to be a literary scholar too. So as I start to work on my doctoral work and I'm reading scholarship, I start to sort of take this self-reflexive study of my own work and what am I trying to do and like being intentional about it. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to cite are the sort of direction that I just organically gravitated towards was Black geography. And so, but one of the things that I feel affirmed by is Kevin Kwashi's book, Black Aliveness, which in which he cites the Greek term poesis as, quote, the activity in which a person brings something into being that did not exist before. And he refers to this as ontological making, which in the context of a Black world is, quote, the intelligence to be had in being through relationality, end quote. And then R.A. Judy also talks about this in Restless Flying, a Black study of revolutionary humanism, where he draws a lineage of poetic sociality between the Black surrealist poets of Martinique during the interwar period, Aimé Césaire, who was invoked this morning, and Crew and Suzanne Césaire, and a Tunisian uprising in 1994. And he understands poetic sociality coming from that original Greek term poesis as a spontaneous socialization or eruption of the crowd, like this idea that the making of poesis is a communal making. And that's, I know we're not a literary conference, but that's interesting to me because of the way that the I works in traditional American poetry as a perspective of the singular transcendental subject. So just thinking of like, oh, this idea of Black poetry as a tool for world making for the arising being in relation. And so as I was studying simultaneously, the concept of space was prominent in the scholarship I was reading within Black studies. I've been thinking a lot about Nathan Hare's concept of Black ecology, about Sylvia Wynter's socio-spatial epochs, and Catherine McKittrick's cartographies of struggle. And one moment that was particularly motivating for this project I'm working on was Saidiya Hartman's idea of the enclosure in her conversation with Fred Moten for the Black Outdoors Innovations in the Poetics of Study series that J. Cameron Carter and Sarah Jane Cervenak ran at Duke for a while. And this talk is online, where she says, I'll quote her in a second because it has to do with the next poems I'll read. But as a result, my creative work began moving toward an intertextual project in which a specific place, Louisville, for example, was supplanted by a conceptual and ecological framing of space, which I'm calling the Black Outside, and that's the project I'm working on now. And it's an intertextual project. It kind of began as this homage to Black studies and all the scholars I was reading and being in a way to be in conversation. But now it's kind of developed into this two-part project. The first book, which is done, and the second book, which I'm gonna talk about after a couple more poems from the first book. So while horsepower was site-specific, there's so much going on. How do I get back to the... Okay, sorry. I realized I had that screen up the whole time with those little words, but so this project, The Black Outside, this is my dream cover, but you know, I gotta argue with presses. But this is a photo of my father and his siblings in Cleveland in 1967. And I just like this photo because my father talks a lot about how people was always telling him he was hiding in plain sight. And I don't know, this image just seems so definitive of all of the themes that I'm thinking through. And my father's father, took this photo. He was a photographer. My oldest uncle, Uncle Bubble, right here on the right, calls my dad a climbing ass. He was a climbing ass. So this project is animated by these two quotes that I was just thinking about for the longest. And the first is, I don't think it's written anywhere, but it's something she says at a film festival, Tony K. Bambara. To be trapped in other people's fiction puts us under arrest. And so in terms of spatiality, I'm thinking about I was thinking, I was just sort of obsessed with this idea like that Black folks, of Black folks being trapped in someone else's fiction, which is to say Western reality, right? When they're kidnapped into the new world, which is a fiction, and that someone has made up and said, this is what it is. Um, and then following that, Sadia Hartman's quote from that talk I mentioned earlier, the enclosure is so brutal. And so the Black outside is a response. It's to that, like the Black outside refers to outside of the enclosure in all of its iterations. And I'm thinking, to cite Dr. Roane again, I'm thinking about it as a Black commons. But the Black outside as a project is a genealogy, is an archive, thinking about the poetic sequence as a method of archive. And so in book one, the archive is defined by the literature. And in book two, it's going to turn towards praxis. So I'm going to share, let's see, how much time do I have? 3 minutes? Okay. 2 minutes. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So that's like one poem. Okay. So this series is I think it was, who mentioned Clyde Woods earlier? Oh, Dr. Eves. Yes. I was like, yes, because I also love Clyde Woods very much in his book, Development Arrested. But specifically this series, the title series in book one is The Black Outside, is really inspired by that book and Clyde Woods' work around the blues as an epistemology, as a Black epistemology, and a platform for a political voice. So let's see, I'll just read one. There was so much to say. I basically annotated all of these. So maybe I can share, I don't know, afterwards. They're all published now, but I'll just do this first one I wrote. I'll just say before I read, I wrote one, the first in 2020. The second was a commission by LACMA for the Obama portraits, which was a very fraught thing for me, and I had to make some decisions, and I ended up using that. And it was written in 2021. The third was written in 2022, commissioned by the Frederick Douglass Society. The fourth, 2023, and the fifth was just written this year in 2024. And I didn't notice until I was putting this together that I had written one a year for the last 5 years. And each one deals with a classical Black music tradition. So the first one I wrote was jazz. The second was the blues. The third was spirituals. The fourth was soul, and the fifth was funk. And I'll just read the jazz one. Should I read that? No, let me read I'm gonna read the blues one. So again, this was commissioned by LACMA for the Obama portraits. I could choose Barack's or I could choose Michelle's. I chose Barack's because of the ecology that Kehinde Wiley uses in his work. And I wanted to be in conversation with the artist as opposed to writing like a sort of tribute to a president, because that's not something I'm interested in doing. And for each of these poems too, it's like addressing a particular enclosure and writing through the Black outside as a portal. And so the enclosure of this one, like the first one is like gentrification. The second one, this one is the nation state. The Black outside. We brought the blues, the voices of the field, into the commemorative big house. We carried seeds from home in our hair like lice. We wore blue lilies, ecosystems above our ears. We came into this world, but we're not of it. Of the refuse, but not the refined. The ritual of wormwood, but not waste. Here's to the rot in us, which would otherwise be abundance if we could be otherwise, which would otherwise be alive if we could otherwise be. The way our feet hover spectral among the foliage, the way we recognize one another across the long centuries inside without the right language and names, We brought the blues. We carried them between our ears, in from outside, the voices of our dead alive in our hair like seeds. We survived spectral. Outside the Constitution, we are otherwise abundant. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, they neither toil nor spin. We brought the blues into this world, but refused to be of it. We went missing, went marine, marooned in grief's aquatic caves, ate the dirt and the lice. Among the foliage, there is no language of waste. There is no rot. We commemorate the ecosystems that would otherwise be. The centurion worm wearing the field. Oh, beloved, I hear you outside singing so clear my ritual names. So I'll just close in saying that, thank you. There's also this envoy at the end, each directly addresses the beloved, and it's like a temporal, again, the Black outside, thinking of it as a portal, so it puts us in a particular, the address creates a particular temporal relationship. But one thing that I'm turning towards in book 2 is, for my doctoral studies, I specifically focused on the Black surrealist in Martinique of the interwar period. So I'm applying like surrealist techniques and non-Western modes like recursivity. So like things coming back around. And I'm thinking of this Senegalese proverb, evil moves in straight lines. But also like forms of storytelling. And so I don't know, I'll leave the annotations here for a second. But again, this first project was about archiving strategies that I came across in the literature. And the second project, for the next year, I'll be traveling to different locations. So Louisville, I live in Pittsburgh, and I have projects started there. Some collaborations back home in Louisville, but also to my ancestral homelands in Alabama. And Martinique, to look for Black commons, to be in these Black commons, and to create an archive, with opacity, I'll say, for book 2. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Give them another round of applause. Thank you. Actually, I'm not going to use the mic. Can y'all hear me? Oh, you need it? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Because it's just so weird hearing my voice. I'm like, what is that? So one thing that both of your works always is making me think about is the centrality of the South to reterritorialization and remapping of Black ecological futures. So I would like to hear each of you say a little bit more about the importance of the Black South in articulating Black futures when historically and presently it continues to be casted as a region of Black unlivability.
Yes.
Oh,
Is that good? Oh, I can use this. I don't know. Okay. All right. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm personally committed to my home community in Virginia, and so it's very personal for me but I think more than just my own sense of like my family's capacity to exist as we have, at least for the last couple of 100 years, is, beyond it just being dependent on that one specific place. I think it's the scene of the crime. It's like where we have to return in terms of the plantations, logics, and I don't mean that doesn't mean necessarily a literal return, but to really disentangle ourselves from that legacy, that ongoing kind of shaping of infrastructures of harm and death, and Ruthie Gilmore's work was invoked earlier, but her definition of racism. To undo all that, I think we have to be engaged. And I also think the South is our best touching off point to be outside the nation state formulation. I think it invites us to think with South connections. It invites us to think with various kinds of solidarities. I think Jordan's invocation of Black home, Mississippi, is complicated. I mean, her parents were from Jamaica. When she goes to Clonmel, where her mother was born and raised, she like, this ain't the type of rural I was talking about, right? She like, that ain't it. But I do think I think that those South-South connections, those histories and entanglements between plantations and ongoing processes of mining and extraction and violence and disposability of people and place, is a different starting point than being at the center of a nation state or its representative. So I think it's a point of spatial translation and possibility that give us new power, new forms of power. And I'll say as well again, I think I also just think that the South is outside of a romance, even a Black radical romance. It's the epicenter of like Black radicalism in this context, and so I think to emphasize it as retrograde or repressive hides the reality that repressiveness is in response. It's responding to what Woods is describing as the blues epistemology. Um, and so we have to excavate those kind of traditions and relationships and build on them. And not, again, through Jordan, not as a simple, straightforward return, but as a way of inviting new possibilities for connection and kinship out from our small forms of local territoriality up to global.
I'm thinking about the first thing I just want to say to the idea of I can't exactly remember how you phrase it, but we've been talking about this, the way that to use ecology as a strategy for defense and reterritorialization and things like that. But it reminds me of this time I lived in Houston for a number of years, and I like to drive. I like to be in cars, but I like to drive from Houston back home to Louisville, and so I would always stop in Memphis. That would be like my middle place to stop for the night. And on one drive, I took a cut that wasn't the highways. It was like through the back roads all the way to Memphis for like, I don't know, I was like 50 miles or so. And I rode through all these like crop farms, but then suddenly I went through this forested portion of the road and it got dark. Like that's how like forested it was, like the tree canopies and everything. And I saw a sign on the side of the road and it said, I saw two signs. The first said unincorporated. It was something like an unincorporated town. And then the second was birthplace of Isaac Hayes. And I'm just thinking of like, yes, like how that unincorporation protects in terms of, discouraging access, so a way to kind of stay hidden as opposed to like, the suburbs where you got HOAs and you got to keep your yard manicured and stuff like that. I think like manicuring nature is like a part of this death cult that is happening. But so yeah, so I'm thinking about that. But returning to the South, we gotta think about the concept of visit, maybe visit, return, but like don't stay. But like, I don't know. I just moved to not, I mean, like if you live here and you from there, but I just moved to Pittsburgh like a little bit over a year ago for this job, and it's my first time living out of the South permanently, and so I'm sad right now. But I don't know. I think as a poet, I'm thinking about language, like going back home, which I think that's for everybody, even Black folks in the North, because the language holds culture, history, memory, and some of that language you can only get it there. I'm thinking about the idea that there's no linear progression of time, that we're in the same moment. Like, and so going back to the South isn't about like going back in time, but it's a spatial movement to locate like, yes, that language, that culture, what happened, the scene of the crime. Yeah, I don't know if I can add anything that Dr. Roane hasn't already said.
I have a second question, but then I'll turn it over, invite audience members to speak. Joy, the poem that you last shared had me thinking a lot about spirituality. I'm in particular interested in conjure in the ways that conjure is the basis of Black Southern cosmologies, epistemologies. And so I just wanted to hear, I promise a question is going to come out of this. In the first poem you shared with us, blue porch stood out to me because the color blue in conjure is a color of protection. So I was wondering, was that intentional? And if both of you could speak to the role of spirituality in thinking about, ecological futures. Like what is the role of spirituality for you in particular? How does spirituality play a role in the being outside of the enclosure? Yeah.
Oh my
so,
goodness.
yeah.
Your questions are so, it's like I could talk about them for
Yeah.
hours. Like, I also the thing I was trying to remember to say was because of the Great Migration, there is a rupture in what we know about back there in the scene of the crime, and a lot of our ancestors and elders do not speak about before. And so sometimes we have to go back for ourselves. But spirituality. Yes, the blue porch was intentional. My grandmother and her sister, because I was talking about her sister, which was the Louisville grandmother. My grandmother lived. She passed away in 2022 in Cleveland, and my great aunt Ma lived in Louisville. So, anyways, yes, her entire porch was blue, and from them, I don't know. I get so many, all of the synchronization and the spirituality comes from them. And like right now I have a dumb cane plant was my great grandmother's, and she lived in Moulton, Alabama, and it comes all the way from there. And I'm thinking about how the plant, I guess herbalism is a part of spirituality in the way I think about it, but the plant it can paralyze your vocal cords and other things. Like I learned from them about it. So, but I don't know. I've been thinking about spirituality in the context of Black surrealisms. And to me, Black ecology is a disruption of Western metaphysics. So it's like the ways that John Locke and Descartes and all them came through and was like, man is separate from nature. And the relationship to nature is ownership. For me, Black surrealism is like this response in saying like, that's not our reality. Our reality involves different socialities and different organizations of what's the real and what's natural and what's metaphysical and what's material and that sort of thing. And I also think a different concept of time, like the idea that in certain Black socialities, the past, present, and future is we all in the same moment.
Right.
And that's how we think about our dead and gone on, that they still here with us right now, so I think a lot about it. I could say many things.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We can talk more later.
I'm gonna turn this. Though I don't have to fumble with that mic. I think I'll answer on two levels. One with June Jordan. I think part of why I'm calling this book Workingly Grounded Prophet is one, to appreciate the reality that June Jordan, even though she despised and critiqued many aspects of patriarchal Christian church theology, she also had an ingrained sense of textual and spiritual practices, and that's in a complicated relationship that she reveals in one of her last works about her childhood. Her father kind of forced her to read the Bible and know it cover to cover, but it also shows up everywhere in her work. And I think even in the Okay Now work, this kind of relationship where people are coming together through the earth is a kind of renewed vision for a spiritual and a cosmological reordering. And I'll use that as a way to say that, I mean, the climate crisis is a crisis of spiritual dimensions. I think one, the theological into the ontological premises of extraction, disposability, and all of that that we inherit is a Western spiritual problem as much as it's a material problem and a social problem and other kinds of problems. So I think it also I think ecologies, maroon ecologies, various kinds of traditions all over the place um, have a relationship to an enrichment with ecologies um, that I think we need to think through as a as a seed for another kind of world. So I also think yeah, I also, I think it's complicated. I mean, especially in the context of what you referenced, the South. I think it's sometimes I realize from the same project that you worked on for the Princeton thing, with that lovely, y'all should check it out for sure. Story mapping, other work that came through that. Um, that even in my film for that project, we were standing in a circle associated with hoodoo. But if I like go tell my cousins we was doing hoodoo, they're gonna be like, stop. But it is bound with our sense of place, our robust sense of place, our sense of ongoingly reproducing that place towards alternative values in a place even like a churchyard. I think it along with maroon sensibilities and other fugitive sensibilities is a part of the other kind of world that already is here that could overtake the sort of Judeo-Christian dominion that we live with the effects of. And I'm thinking here with Dolores Williams, that classic essay. Um, I'm making all of that is a spiritual endeavor. And I think it comes through it as so brilliantly in the iterative like way that you wrote Black Outside with the different each of those also for me each of those musical genres is also a cosmology. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a sense of spirituality even tied to a certain um kind of being per se, but just our some return to a sense of our collective being that we do lack in the overemphasis even in critical versions of material relation.
Did you read the reissue of Development Arrested where Ruth Wilson Gilmore does the introduction and she says, Clyde Wood's dissertation advisor instructed him to call this a blues epistemology, but I wish he would have called it a blues ontology, like a form of a way of being for Black people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So I want to open it up to questions.
We only got 10 minutes. I'm sad. It's over.
Thank you both. I'm thinking a lot about just what prompted from your talk about how Black spaces per se, like in the Green Book, offered refuge. I think Dr. Priest, in your annotated notes, you mentioned, right, a loophole retreat, amidst the danger that travel presented. To your point, Dr. Roane, right, like urban renewal was Negro removal in many of these places and communities. So I'm curious from both of you, how do you see the loophole retreat in that space of interiority amidst, right, the ongoing fugitivity as possibility for Black placemaking and Black futures?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I think about a lot. Two of the poems I didn't read actually address this. And I know we had an ecology seminar, but for some reason, the car comes up a lot for me, the car in Black culture as a loophole of retreat. And I mean, we could say that it's a kind of method of recycling too, because I'm talking about these old schools, like not, like taking a car and what's the word? I, I'm getting refurbishing, but that's not what I'm trying to say. But like flipping the car basically. But I'm thinking about too, how like where in my neighborhood growing up, people would get in the car and just like cipher the block, and a space to be in, um, a space to kind of enter, a space where there's like connection through sound, because music to me is associated with the car. Um, but yeah, I don't know. That's I'll let you say some stuff. Something else might come up.
No, I like this idea of the car as a loophole retreat. I mean, in Virginia and Tappahannock, you have to drive, and I
Yes, in the
collect the
South.
yeah, in general. I
Yeah.
collect the oral history of my father on the road, and realized like my father was heavy into cars, like heavy, heavy. Like had a new car every 5 years to like kind of try to do it over and then sell it. It was like, oh, we gonna stick with this one now. But part of it was, I think, like you could talk to him in that oral history, and he and his friend, best friend Bumpy Ross, when they used to attend the segregated movie theaters and throw sodas and other stuff at the white patrons below, they had to, if they couldn't catch this older gentleman that they used to catch a ride from, they had to jump in the woods when they heard cars coming. So I think that is, I mean, and I think that's the part of Black geographies is sussing out where these loophole of retreats exist, and not taking stuff like, for example, cars and equals oil equals your relationship to a destructive extractive relationship as just like givens, and actually unpacking different moments of possibility within that. And I think that's Black studies. I mean, we all we got is the loophole of retreat. I think, and I think some of what June Jordan was thinking about, there's in the how-to guide, she tried to guide people to how do you transform land in Mississippi through a kind of takedown policy wise of land subsidy. By the time she gets to this other one, I think the loophole of retreat is the like novel itself. It functions in that way. You're supposed to see you're in this point of possibility where you don't even know how they came to this plantation, how they got it, a possible future in this land. So I think that's what that in some ways that is the like Black studies tradition, especially Black geographies into Black ecologies and abolitionist ecologies and abolitionist geographies tradition is to locate those, map them opaquely, critically. We ain't trying to expose nobody to the state and violence or nothing else. And then mobilize that map in new projects of liberation and possibility. So
I'm saying in Louisville too, like the car culture is so prominent. And I think we have that in common with like Detroit. And so these are places where factory assembly lines were dominant. And Louisville's not, it's a part of the South, but it was a great migration destination too. Like people just got off the train early, basically. But cars too is like as like a source of mobility and flight. When coming in, I remember reading this thing about Louisville, old Louisville, where there was a trolley system, but then it didn't go to certain places. And so to have a car was like major. But we have like on Derby, instead of going to the racetrack, which we wouldn't have been able to be allowed into, and it's a very rich space, we had Derby on Broadway in the West End, which was Black Louisville. And basically it was like the city was forced to shut the streets down because it would just become like a car show and like people walking and dancing in the street. And it's like, I don't know, it reminds me of like Freaknik or Mardi Gras or something. It was like our version. But and then also that we gather at those Olmsted parks on Sundays with the cars as well. So it incites us, incite assembly. And then just real quick, lastly, I was gonna say that the poem for me is a loophole because, and I'm just gonna cite Margaret Walker, who said the the page can be burned, but a song can't.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and someone asked a question
yesterday evening following our other panels that I think would be a perfect question to end us on. And so I apologize for those who have burning questions. Hopefully our speakers have a few more minutes after we close to answer those. But I actually want to ask Jessica Rucker to ask the question that you asked yesterday evening, if you remember.
Thank you so much. I think one of the questions I'm thinking about is what makes something a Black space versus a Black place. And then when do Black places become Black geographies or Black cultural landscapes? Thank you for that. Thank you.
You know, like I'm a fake geographer, so I'm sitting here like, place, space. Let me rack my brain about like how all these things actually relate. But I think, thank you for that. That's an important, because I think part of what you're getting us to is like, how do we move from the loophole to like a whole map of territoriality of liberation and possibility and freedom. That's how I'm taking the question, and I think for me, a black place is. I think this was added to the conversation yesterday. Often it's an ephemeral thing in terms of its physical material dynamics. So it's not necessarily about, although it is often looped through and threaded through questions of land and other things, I think it's essentially a alternative human to human relation that doesn't say I can own you or anything that is related to you. I think that's the sense of the loophole that I would like to hold down. I know there are other versions of that possibly. And I think that has continually to be remade into larger scales of like not just my individual vision of place, but a working theory of space as the relationship between time and space and how they might relate differently outside the infrastructures of extraction, harm, violence, premature death and disposability that govern both Western Earth stewardship and their relationship to us as part of that matrix. So I think the work to get to the full map of freedom and Black ecologies in some ways to riff off of Ruthie's abolitionist, invocations of like freedom as a place and all of that um, is to organize, is to think about the ways that we come together in alternative infrastructures. For me, increasingly, especially in this moment, this may not be a popular sentiment, but outside the state, outside of formulations that suggest that we can have a a figure at the top that we can call on for certain protections of rights or just the right to live itself. Um, I'm into stuff like people's assemblies and what it might mean for us to like cross pollinate across places even with our students, even with our with the resource again to invoke Ruthie, but a foot in and a foot out of these academic institutions. Or I think Moulton was invoked yesterday, Moulton and Harney with an undercommons, like using these resources in these places to generate what we need in that direct dynamic relationship with bottom up democracy. I think though, and I Empower DC is doing that type of work. It's great to see that, and I think that's how we get from these small windows of like fleeting possibility and futurity and alternative infrastructure to something lasting and permanent, is to both to turn to those, build up from those, and to turn away from a faith in capital or the state, because they gonna kill us dead every time.
Yeah, I'm not a Black geographer either, but I just look in the literature, in Black literature, for Black geographies. And I mean, on a basic level, the way I understand it is like place is a physical, specific place, and space is can be a material or super material place where, for me, like a Black space where, yeah, Black people are assembled and and acting transgressively against Western enclosure. So outside of Western enclosure, meaning like, yes, like I'm thinking about like John Locke saying, I have it somewhere here, but he said like, the wild savage who knows no enclosure. So the idea that like any kind of place where so enclosures can take on many different forms, like physical buildings. So being in like a maroon in the forest would be like a black outside, or would be like a black geography. But also one of the other enclosures I'm thinking about is English, like the language. And so being outside of standard English in our communications with each other, covert speech, elliptical speech acts, as Glissant talks about. Yeah, so I don't know if I added anything, but just trying to give some examples. Subsistence gardens instead of like cash crops, you know, any space where transgressive action, speaking, thinking is happening outside of Western enclosures.